It's been called the greatest millionaire migration in history, according to a newly released Henley Partners private wealth migration report for 2025. A record 142,000 millionaires are expected to pack their bags and relocate this year. And at the very top of their wish list, well, of course, the United Arab Emirates, and specifically here, Dubai. The UAE is set to welcome nearly 10,000 new millionaires in 2025 alone, more than any country in the world. And of course, many people assume it's all about the lack of personal income tax. But the real story is far more layered, from political stability and safety to long-term residency programs and increasingly sophisticated financial services sector. The UAE has positioned itself as a true global magnet for wealth. That's why I'm here. At the same time, traditional wealth hubs like the UK, France, and even China are seeing unprecedented outflows of high net worth individuals, reshaping the global map of private wealth. So what's driving this historic shift, and what does it mean for the Middle East's economic future? To help us unpack those numbers, the motivations, and even the misconceptions behind the headlines, I'm joined now by someone who probably is fair to say, I think, has their finger firmly on the pulse, and particularly to do with this report. Philippe Amarante, the managing partner at Henley and Partners Middle East, and also head of government advisory for EMEA. Philippe, thank you so much for joining us on Mira Business FM.
Very good day, and thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. Let's just jump straight into this report. It projects that a record 142,000 millionaires are relocating globally in 2025. The UAE, a leading destination. Why is that?
Because they can, is the short answer. But let's dive into this a little bit more in detail. I think there are probably 4 or 5 reasons behind this phenomenon that we are tracking now since a couple of years, actually, right? It's not the first report. And the UAE, since maybe the pandemic, since COVID has come out, always very storming, always taking the crown as being one of the fastest growing appeals and basically market jurisdictions to attract these ultra high net worth or high net worth individuals. And it comes out of, I guess, a little bit of wake up call that we all had during the pandemic, where no matter where you were, no matter who you were, even strongest passports or strongest residences from one day to the other were maybe a bit weaker. And people understood that, hold on a second, that's maybe not how I would like to manage my wealth or my estate. So you have a very strong wealth preservation and sort of wealth protection component in that equation. And the UAE, as a result of the pandemic, has done some incredible measures. As we all know, it's a pro-immigration sentiment here. You don't find that in Europe, right? You don't find that in the UK. It's very difficult to relocate and migrate, whereas here it's exactly the opposite. So they took that as a chance, and it's appealing. A second, again, thanks to the pandemic, people came here because it was the only place to go. Right, a lot of famous destinations were under lockdown, and families came here and realized, hold on a second, this is actually a great place to be.
It was open.
It was open. You could do your shopping. You can, go out with your kids. It was a little bit back to normality, and I think that is where ultra high net worth clients, families realize that this is not a bad place. And I would say maybe even more fueled by this constant hunger of the UAE to stay on the top of the game, be innovative, be agile, and treat investors or residents and its citizens more as partners than just a number. I think that resonated very, very well. But then thirdly, just to finish that up, it's a global phenomenon, right? As you just said at the beginning, the previous known jurisdictions, countries that were maybe the art, the benchmark. Let's talk about the UK. You can have maybe a different opinion about the United States or Germany, where I'm coming from. They do not appeal that much anymore, because of maybe weaker leadership, maybe less agility, and other, social stresses that come out, which are all at the end of the day associated with where do I want to be as a successful, wealthy person? Where do I think I can protect my assets? Right? Where do I find ecosystems that I can further maybe grow my wealth, build my business, have my kids being educated in a good way? And then on top of that, have all the amenities that are important: convenience, safety, healthcare, etc. So it's all of these things actually that I believe are the key driver.
We'll come on to some more of those push and pull factors, particularly people that are being pushed away from countries like the UK, but specifically on the UAE. You know, whenever we talk about millionaires migrating, and even just everyday people migrating to the UAE, people go, oh, well, it's for tax reasons, isn't it? Because you're not going to be paying tax. And most likely that probably is one of the biggest factors, but it isn't the only factor.
Not at all. And I maybe make a controversial comment here, right? If you're concerned about tax, then you're not that wealthy. There are obviously a lot of people out there earning quite some money in structuring things. Tax is not really the reason. Having said that, though, the UAE is not a no tax jurisdiction. There's a misconception, as you say. We have secondary taxes here. Everything at the end of the day, every service that you have, there will be a tax on it in some certain way. Nothing is for free, right? But yes, indeed, of course, in comparison to, let's say, the heavyweights in Europe, France, Germany, the tax bands are maybe a little bit more attracting. But they're not the only reason. At the end of the day, you still have a lot of wealth people in the US, and everybody talks about how expensive from a tax perspective the US can be, right? It's a way to, I guess, diversify all your structures, diversify your estate, and, that's where we are good at, diversify your residence.
But that must be one of the kind of factors that a lot of people think about, and then they actually realize, but there is still so much more that the UAE has to offer. So the tax thing might be a big thing for a lot of people, but then actually the list is pretty much endless, and the benefits are so much more than just the tax thing.
Yeah, consider it like various pearls on a string, right? So it's not that one and only argument, one and only reason why people start considering, and using investment migration options to relocate. If you go to the UK, and I've been just recently, there's one thing missing, and maybe it's a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, but there's
the sun,
of course, yeah, of course, and let's not talk about the food or the football. As a German, I might make that joke. No, I think what is missing is a little bit the positive sentiment, the can-do attitude, the things there is economic stimulation, there is activity. And when you speak to people in the UK who have quite some track record in building complex, successful projects, businesses around the world, they all are actually saying, look, this is not the environment where I or we can thrive. And that comes back then to a little bit maybe regulation, again, government agility, nimbleness, trying to innovate and doing the right things, maybe not the wrong things. And that's where the UAE, I believe, is just setting itself a little bit apart from others.
Sticking on the UK in particular, the report suggests that the UK will experience its largest ever net millionaire outflow in 2025, losing 16,500 millionaires, surpassing China even. I remember looking at these stats just last year, and China was still number one, but it seems now the UK will overtake China. Other European nations as well, France, Spain, Germany, Ireland, Norway, Sweden, are also seeing net losses. So beyond the kind of tax changes, what broader economic, maybe even regulatory or perception shifts are driving a mass exodus out of places like the UK?
Yeah, so the UK, it got hit hard a bit over the past years, I guess. And there are a lot of events that happened in, around, or with the UK that does not give investors, confidence, and does not give investors certainty. And that's about maybe change in government direction. That's about, major events such as Brexit. That's, let's not talk about the weather. Many, many other things. And it accumulates, right? It's a mix of things. It's a summary of events that at the end of the day starts with one domino, and then all the others will follow, right? There's the peer effect as well. And I will say, 8 years ago, 9 years ago, obviously the attractiveness of the UAE to really relocate wealth and get people here for good was not as strong. Yes, you had people buying homes. Yes, you had people coming in, having a good time over winter. But what we see right now is that people are really relocating, shifting, and lifting and shifting their structures. And that is because it's a wider conversation that you also look at, hold on, this guy is doing it, I maybe have to consider that as well. And it comes back to the point I said before, because they can, right? It's just a different landscape that we live in right now. And by the way, UAE is not the only beneficiary of that. Brits are going to Portugal, go to Spain, go to Italy, right? There is an outflow. There's an outflow because there have been also so many wealthy people in the UK now getting a little bit frustrated about all of these events. And then again, on top of that comes the tax hammer.
But it's happening so much now that even the British government are thinking of bringing in specific legislation that will not potentially hamper these ultra high net worth individuals, but it's something that they will have to think about when they are abroad. They will still have to contribute as if they are a UK resident. And these kind of bits of legislation, is that putting people off, or are people still happy to get out of the UK?
Yeah, well, I think it first of all, it starts arguments, debate, and conversation, right, amongst these people and amongst the relevant stakeholders. And it creates maybe the worst thing that a country or an investor brand can have, uncertainty. And I come back to that, and where, the UAE is probably, and Singapore for that matter as well, right, have been steadfast in decision making and have been very reliable in terms of how to innovate and how to push the envelope moving forward. And the UK is not having that. So these are tactical measures that, again, make people maybe scratching more their head. But that's not where you would consider putting your assets in. So, and I would say, though, being a big fan of the UK, I mean, I lived there for 7-8 years. I love the UK. It's one of the most amazing countries. And they will bounce back for sure. But I think at the moment, we're just a little bit in this perfect storm where also government maybe does not really know how to service these people. Something coming back again to the UAE, they do it phenomenally well, right? I said this before, you are not just a number, you are a partner. Well, if you go to Germany, where I'm from, you want to set up a company, good luck. You're just somewhere in the middle of administration and bureaucracy. You're not treated in the way that maybe you wish to be treated, because that's how you have succeeded in building your enterprises and your businesses. They do exactly the same thing here. So you're not just someone working with government, you're working in partnership and collaboration. And I think, the UK will probably realize that at some point. Maybe it takes longer than we all think. But what goes down comes up and the other way around.
So you feel the UAE perhaps gives people a kind of sense of purpose and a sense of belonging when they're here, when they're relocating here, whether they're opening a business or whatever it may be.
Bit of appreciation.
Yeah, exactly.
Respected and treated fair and equal, maybe even. It's a nice way to look at that. I mean, we're all here, right? And at the end of the day, it is something where, services are very accessible. Everything is in some level or the other very convenient. And you do not have this maybe sometimes very traditional European bureaucracy wall in between servant and agent. You know what I mean? That's where they do fantastic here.
Philippe, the report underscores that relocating millionaires can bring significant benefits. So the forex revenue, business creation, stock market boosting as well, job creation, and kind of broader multiplier effects. How has the UAE kind of quantified these broader effects from your understanding?
Well, that's a great question. Thanks for that. You're absolutely right. I think there is a wider economic stimulation happening underneath, right? And which goes much more beyond, buying a property. And where the UAE has done some very good, I think, headlines over the past years. Hedge funds are coming, investment bankers are coming, deals are made, access to the sovereign wealth funds is there. There's, stock market activity, there are IPOs happening here. There's expansion, there's activity, there's prosperity. Let's draw this back to the UK. It's maybe a bit less of that in that sort of scale. And that's where you really have economic benefits by people coming here, staying a bit longer, spending more money on hospitality, maybe sending their kids to school here, to university, maybe buying into a business, maybe employing more people, maybe engaging in certain activities here, and it all adds up, right? And that's where you have the proof in the pudding by actually the service industry understanding that, hold on a second, we're going to be there. We need to be in Dubai. We need to be in Abu Dhabi because that's where activities are happening. We want to be close to service them.
When we look particularly at family offices relocating here, that seems to be something that has been consistently on the rise over the last decade or so. Why is that trend happening? What's the shift? Okay, you can get individuals who have a lot of money and want to relocate here, maybe with families and the like. But family offices in particular, what pulls them to the UAE, and why are they wanting to leave, where their home essentially is?
Because maybe some years ago, the UAE wasn't ready for hosting and welcoming these family office structures. There always has to be regulation, legislation underneath, and governance. And DIFC, ADGM, they have done some good work in that field. Understanding strategically, if you provide that right regulation and that right legislation and policy, you might become part of the wider consideration. Second, there's obviously more and more private wealth, generated around the world, even from areas and markets that are maybe not your most common wealth hubs. We look into Africa, we look in Southeast Asia. Phenomenal stories then. The tech scene, agriculture, etc. They are already very much, in love, or they know the UAE. Hence why maybe setting up the family office, it's not about lifting and shifting. It's not about moving it from somewhere. It's actually just setting one up in the first place, right? And then thirdly, I guess that's where sometimes the traditional banks get a little bit nervous and frustrated. Some of these clients and wealthy people, they do not believe in the business model of wealth management or wealth planners. They like to have, in addition, and it's not always black and white, they like to have their own little family office and running the financial affairs of the family of the estate.
One thing that I found here, and this is just me as an individual, when I moved out here, the services are so well connected. So if you want to set up your license, they've got the ins with the banks and all that kind of stuff. The services are just very well connected and everything is there for you right in front of you. Whereas if I think you're relocating to one of the countries we listed earlier, it seems a bit sporadic and very hard to kind of get everything under one list and do it all together. How important of a role does that play? That the UAE and Dubai in particular and Abu Dhabi just makes life easier for people who want to move over, and particularly those people who've got a lot of money and less time.
But that's the light bulb moment, right, that I mentioned before. Particularly those who maybe have not been here before. Maybe they transited through Dubai, but they never really spent some quality time here. And now they're here and realize that golden visa issued within a week. Fantastic. Bank accounts, depending on the structure of the client, can be opened maybe also quite swiftly. Real estate transactions, that's actually very, very fast. Whether it's good or bad, I'll leave that someone else to assess on. But you're right. They realize that this is a very efficient sort of ecosystem where things just get done, and I don't have to waste my energy, my time on things where, again, coming back to the number example, I'm not just a little cog in a big wheel, and I need to wait for my turn at the counter.
Specifically on golden visa, how influential are these kind of long-term residency programs that the UAE offers, and also the regulatory frameworks as well for luring in ultra high net worths and high net worth clients?
It's a smart move. It's a smart move because one of the learnings that also we as practitioners have seen when the first lockdowns came, right? People who do or did not have long-term residences were also quickly out. And, you might remember that, I don't know whether you were here, there were abandoned cars, abandoned apartments, villas and whatnot. People, the bond, right? The anchoring, the belonging was just maybe not as strong as with a long-term, maybe even permanent residence, right? And I think the UAE leadership realized that and now offer people to basically, build deeper roots, get stronger engagement, maybe more steady engagement in the long run. So it's a great tool. Now, is it needed for people to invest? Maybe that's debatable, but it's definitely something that I believe emotionally, psychologically makes you feel a little bit wanting to stay here for longer than maybe previously people did.
And so within Henley and Partners, what kind of trends are you guys seeing amongst clients? For example, choosing the UAE for that visa flexibility or business setup ease and things like that. What conversations are you having and what trends are you seeing amongst people that you speak to?
And it's very simple. Those who have a global mindset, right? Those families, those clients, those investors, whatever you want to call it, they want to hedge, they want to de-risk. They want to de-risk against events that we just talked about, whether it's Brexit, whether it's tension, whether it's, pandemics, whether it's anything that come up, and want to have basically a little bit of a certainty in going on of their affairs. Hence why they built structures in every corner of the world. So what we see right now, it's creation of residence portfolios. That's where we are a mosaic, a small but an important mosaic in the wider wealth planning and estate planning conversation with clients, where you say, look, whatever's going to happen, no matter on how strong the rain is going to be, I will have somewhere a dry pair of shoes, right? And I can use them and continue to walk. So people are doing residences in reliable, trustworthy jurisdictions where they feel welcomed, where things get done most efficient, very efficient, as we just talked about, where they feel there's strong rule of law, strong regulation. And that's where people are investing in the UAE. They maybe do something in Europe. They maybe do something in Asia. And, the New Zealand conversation, you really want to have let me put it that way, the very very are going to be far away if things go belly up. You're just going to invest in New Zealand, have a residence there as well.
And have loads of sheep on your farm.
That's correct, indeed.
That's exactly the
trend. You're going to become a rugby fan, I guess.
Yes. Saudi Arabia is a bit of a rising magnet as well. And I think that's mentioned in the report. There's a net of 2,400 migrating millionaires in 2025, many returning nationals as well, and foreign investors. What kind of parallels or differences do you see between Saudi Arabia and the UAE in attracting those high net worth individuals?
It's a great question. I think you just said it there. We need to be a little bit careful on the data to not think that all of a sudden, people who maybe never been in Saudi, have no association, are just going. There is a lot of returning.
Why is that?
I think because there is an incredible success story written in Saudi, right? I've been a couple of times. I'm a resident in Saudi, by the way. So, and it's quite extraordinary to see what transformation they are undertaking. Yes, it's maybe not everything reality that you saw once on Bloomberg headline, but still the sheer scale of this change socially, economically, is just fantastic. There's so much business activity, there's so much capital, there's so much hunger within the population itself, right? For innovative ideas, tech stuff. So that attracts people, right? And then you have also change in legislation. And Saudi has now also a bit of a premium residence product. And for a lot of people, particularly in this part of this world, this means something, right? This means culturally also something of very, very importance, where you maybe can be a little bit closer to things that give you orientation in life. And that appeals, right? So you can buy a house, you can invest in certain things, and being at the end of the day, let's call it a small shareholder in maybe one of the most transformative economic changes that the world has ever seen.
I'd be really interested to get your thoughts on Saudi and the UAE and other countries in the Middle East, particularly those who are from Europe and the West. And, there's always been a bit of perception about Middle Eastern countries when you're talking specifically about kind of cultural trends and things like that. But that seems to really have shifted. Or are people just following where the money is, or are people kind of taking those kind of cultural elements into account as well when they are making the shift?
I think there's probably also a bit of a better understanding of the nuances of certain things, right? There is more awareness about certain things, and let's be honest, not to everybody around the world Dubai or Saudi will appeal, right? There's still a perception amongst a few people that when you talk about Dubai, I will never go, right? Are the women even allowed to drive a car, right? There's a little bit that maybe wrong perception, and Saudi will also not be appealing to everyone. But
well, I have to admit, we lived in Saudi for a few years when I was a kid, and my mum thoroughly enjoyed not driving. Yeah. So if we return there, I think she'd be very unhappy because she'd have to jump back.
Has to drive now.
Yeah.
and traffic, we complain here about Sheikh Zayed Road. My God, Riyadh is a different beast.
Yeah. I just picking up on that Saudi point and people looking at countries like that. Dubai is very, very busy right now. There is a huge influx, as we know from the data, of millionaires. Do you think people are now looking past the likes of the UAE and thinking more Saudi and perhaps thinking Qatar or maybe even Bahrain and Kuwait, or are still all eyes on Dubai and the UAE right now?
It depends who you ask, right? But I will say that the GCC countries, the neighbors, the friends here, each and one of them has their own value proposition. And while it's, of course, people like to compete in luring in the high net worth, ultra high net worth, there are certain really, really strong differentiation factors between, let's say, Saudi and the UAE, and where maybe Saudi will not and should not, and even would be unable to compete with. Let's talk about agility, right? Talk about a country of 10 million people versus a country of 30 million people. It's just a different game, right? You talk about Bahrain, that's a lack of international connectivity, by design. They don't have two major carriers like here the UAE has with Etihad and Emirates. So there are certain things where the UAE will remain very, very strong in their positioning. And then it's also a bit of, I guess, the brand building and the positioning of Dubai as a super brand, where others still have a little bit of way to go. Having said that, they have found their niches, right? There are fantastic stories happening in Bahrain. There's quite some really interesting real estate investment opportunities in Qatar. I've been 6-8 weeks ago. There's in Saudi, it is just it's from another planet. I will say the speed, what happens there, and the capital, the access to capital for you're a smart person. Let's say you have a great tech idea, you might want to go to Saudi to find some funding, right? And there's a lot of willingness to support these things. So I think they all will find their own little niche. But I guess if you have to cluster the world into a line of the big major pillars, if it's a bridge, you're going to have 2-3 pillars, and the UAE is going to be one of them.
Do you think it can ever get too saturated here?
Depends how you would measure that. In terms of space, hard to say. There's still a lot of desert being undeveloped. I think there will come at some point what happens in a lot of big cities. The risk of maybe the safety will become a challenge to manage.
I think what I mean by that is, and this might seem a bit of a bizarre question, but I think there is some logic behind it. Can there ever be too much wealth in a country or in a city like Dubai, in an emirate like Dubai? Can there ever be too much wealth?
No, I don't think so. Look at the US, right? Where you still have, if you talk quantities, right? The majority of the high net worth, ultra high net worth are based in the US, right? And they do fairly well. You have other small countries. Let's look at Qatar, which is a very wealthy country in terms of GDP. I don't think so. I think the saturation will maybe be more driven by what are the alternatives out there and how much maybe the old dogs, if I can use that word, maybe can come back into the game and close the gap.
With new tricks, yeah.
Yeah, can the UK maybe, reinvent itself, becoming a high net worth friendly jurisdiction that allows these people to come in easy without being labeled in the wrong way, right? And not being stigmatized. If these things can happen, same in Germany, for instance, right? If there will be instruments, methods available, then that might have an impact. But at the moment, it's full steam ahead.
I was going to ask you about that. Where does it leave those countries, the UK, Germany, France alike? Does it leave them kind of sat there crying their eyes out because they're losing all these millionaires and losing all this potential investment? Or is it that, do they now need to get into a mindset of, right, well, what do we need to do to retain the millionaires, but also bring people back that we've lost over the years? Is that the mindset that they need to get into now?
It's a very complex, discussion, obviously. And if I would have the full answer, I might not be sitting here, but sitting in Berlin somewhere, right? But from my peers and from clients that we serve, and also within the government conversations that we have around the world, right? There is a realization that the attraction and retention of talent and capital is utmost key. Right? It's you want to make it simple. You want to get the next Elon Musk. You want him to be in your country, right? Because that maybe unlocks economic, social transformation. There's maybe jobs, there's maybe something else, and on the back of that, just more and more GDP growth. So countries are realizing that. I think the challenge that you have is how to go about it. And as we know, Europe is not shy in having political debates. And if you're standing at the bus stop debating too much, you might miss it. Right, it might just pass by, and I think that's what we're seeing right now. In terms of future model, there are investment-based schemes in Europe. Right, there's Portugal, very popular. There's Greece, there's Italy. There's Latvia. There are many others.
It feels like they're not even making a dent.
They do, but there's a lot of debate about it on whether it's the right thing. Should you allow the wealthy coming in and buying property? Well, if it does create construction jobs, yes, why not, right? If it allows maybe the funds to be deployed via a domestic bank, yes, why not? But we talked about, misconceptions. There's also a misconception, and there's a misconception, particularly in Germany at the moment, that anyone who goes to Dubai is just doing it because of, tax evasion. It's not right. They do it because, number one, again, they can, and number two, in Germany, they don't find the right treatment. And that's not about tax. That's about opportunities, access to capital, funding, regulatory complexities, and certainty, I think. Whenever you have a government every 4 years changing, left or right, and you have then alternatives to that, where it's just straight through the wall, what are you going to choose?
I think consistency is king.
Exactly.
And that's a perfect ender to the conversation. Philippe Amarante, thank you so much for your time. Of course, managing partner at Henley and Partners of Middle East and head of government advisory for EMEA. What a fascinating conversation, and delving into the Henley and Partners report of Millionaires migration for 2025. Thank you.
Oh, pleasure chatting. Thanks.